Hi everyone, and welcome to my fan commentary on the unaired Day of the Dumpster pilot from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, aka the Lost episode, which is basically a featurette of Power Rangers that is available on the Shout Factory DVD if you get the seasons 4 through 7 box set, which is Zeo through Lost Galaxy. But it's really Mighty Morphin centric because this was a special case of a featurette that we had back when Lost Galaxy was on the air, and knowing to the fact this was the 90s era Power Rangers, so there's a lot to uncover with this featurette. As is titled The Lost Episode, it's basically hosted by Austin St. John and Walter Jones, which I'm surprised they actually, mentioned featured Walter's mid-name Emmanuel Jones, or Walter E. Jones is sometimes credited. And then the way how they're showing the opening credits is basically highlighting all the actors that have played the Rangers over the course of mostly the 6 years. Because at the time, Lost Galaxy was just recent at the time. And, and not only that, this was part of the 90s era of Power Rangers, because you can tell. I'm watching, as I'm talking about this commentary, this is something that somebody uploaded on YouTube, which was the broadcast version, because you can see the Fox Kids, 1998 Fox Kids logo we saw back when Power Rangers in Space was on the air during its second half and after it came back from its summer hiatus. I remember back in the days when Power Rangers was still on Fox. I mean, yes, that was when Power Rangers was in its prime. Particularly in the 90s, from, MMPR Season 1 through Lost Galaxy in the 90s. And before Lightspeed Rescue and Time Force and so forth, because, I'm going to regret now not seeing this Lost episode of Power Rangers, but all it was just the original version of Day of the Dumpster. Because when this happened, I never really got to see it because, knowing me, people, I only saw Lost Galaxy's mid-season finale, that being Redemption Day, when it aired, because I'm surprised this happened after Redemption Day aired and Lost Galaxy went on their 3-4 month hiatus. Okay, as soon as they bring up about the history of Power Rangers, when they started mentioning the counterparts of Mighty Morphin, that being Zoo Ranger, they pronounced them as the Go Rangers, when knowing the very first Super Sentai, Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger, was the first Sentai. Zoo Ranger was, the 16th iteration if you go by a certain numbering of the Sentais leading up to O Ranger and Car Ranger to the point. And God, Walter and Austin looked so young back then. God, I miss the 90s so much. And then I think in that old Fox Kids studio lot or one of the old Saban offices, you can see a few monster costumes that were used in like Zeo or Turbo a little bit. And then this is where they highlight, okay, in this portion, this is where they highlight where the show has been so far. But, talking about how far Power Rangers has gotten since the beginning with Mighty Morphin, and then worked the way up to where Lost Galaxy was in their beginning, because Lost Galaxy was so recent. But here, this is where they talk about the history of Power Rangers, particularly the Zordon era, about how Zordon recruited Jason and them to become the first Rangers, and then Tommy joining, and just recapping everything that's happened over the course of, the series up to this point. A Mighty Morphin segment had to go up very quickly. Then they go quickly into Zeo, Turbo, and Space. Not much to say about Lost Galaxy, because again, back then, I think when a lot of people saw this, I mean, I know people just moved on from Power Rangers and thought, Lost Galaxy was like not for us, and knowing the fact, it was the last 90s Power Ranger series, and knowing Lost Galaxy was the last Power Rangers of the 90s to feature anybody left over. And also, look, a little bit of some leftover Gingaman footage that we didn't use in Lost Galaxy from the first episode of Gingaman when they did that pose. Yeah, did they have to fast forward through all of that? Okay, well, and you can also see Austin St. John behind the Gold Ranger suit, and as a mannequin. You can briefly see that. But like I was saying, because back when this special happened, I never did watch this because I was so into Lost Galaxy and saw how this was, fulfilling. But even back then, when I was a very small kid at 7 years old, well, actually big kid age, actually at the exact, I didn't really watch this featurette because I do remember back when Power Rangers in Space was on the air and when it was on its summer hiatus, they aired something similar during In Space known as the Funniest Moments special with John Yon Bosch hosting that. I think this was a great highlight for the 90s era Power Rangers back then because it just go to show how far we had at the time back in the 90s had come since Day of the Dumpster, and then when we got to Lost Galaxy's mid-season point with Magda Defender's sacrifice, like that's a long evolution where we were back then. This part of the special was kind of filler. I mean, I really want to get on to the point with the talking about the lost episode they keep referring to back when this aired. Now on to the lost episode itself, because I really want to talk about a lot of differences that they did similarly to what was supposed to happen before we even got, the actual episode that began the franchise. This is classified as episode 0 because this was a testing ground for Saban to try to shop Power Rangers around to multiple networks, and I thought a lot of networks were not really interested in seeing how Power Rangers would be until they chose Fox, and knowing Fox Kids was the perfect choice to put the show on at the time. But back then, thinking about with this unaired pilot, if we didn't had Power Rangers on Fox Kids then, but what network back then that was airing children's television shows that would have picked up Power Rangers? I wouldn't say Nickelodeon, because Nickelodeon, I don't think they would fit then back then. But like I said, even though knowing this pilot episode, knowing the fact this thing happened in '99, and about that prediction back when Lost Galaxy was on, I had predicted about Power Rangers being on Nickelodeon back when this happened and when Lost Galaxy was on the air. And even during Lightspeed Rescue and Time Force, and I should have never predicted it, but I'm going to do a separate video about that later. There's a lot of differences here where, like, instead of the juice bar, which was, again, Ernie's juice bar wasn't a thing yet in this version of the pilot of Day of the Dumpster. And that guy pushing Zach looks oddly a lot like Jason David Frank, but of course it ain't him. Also, it's been commonplace that, I just thought about with Audrey Dubois, who was Trini here, that if we ended up with Audrey as Trini instead of Tui, I mean, I'm not saying Tui was bad for Trini, we still remember Tui the most because she was our Yellow Ranger for the most majority of the series. But in this pilot, I had no idea they had someone else to play Trini originally before we got to. Now, this part with Paul Schreier, Bulk, being pushed, being pushed by the bowling pins and stuff by Jason, that was kind of crap. Using the bowling alley, I don't think was a good, and then Billy doing a karate chop when he had no experience. And you can see on that TV, you can briefly saw a clip from Saban's adaptation of Samurai Pizza Cats, but even I never really, I never even heard of that show until now. But anyway, like, when they had the bowling alley, it was their testing ground of what was supposed to be the juice bar they would end up having later on in the series. Now, when they used the clip of the astronauts on the moon landing and find Rita's space dumpster, the dialogue here is different from what we had in the actual Day of the Dumpster that we all know and love, which was, again, the real first episode of Power Rangers. Well, this was episode 0. The final Day of the Dumpster is the one we ended up getting, which kicked off the legend of Power Rangers, as I like to proclaim it. I don't know what was the use of this footage of that building pushing forward, because, and then you can see what was Bandor's palace from the, with the palace on top of that rooftop from the final episodes of Zoo Ranger, and knowing the fact that seemed a little too soon at the time. Also, this has been pointed out that that this pilot was a testing ground for the show. And when they did this, the Command Center, Alpha, and Zordon look completely different from what they would look like later on in the actual series. The pilot, for some reason, the pilot versions of Zordon and Alpha, well, Alpha has the same name, but Zordon was dubbed as Zoltar in the pilot. So every time I look at Zoltar's face, well, I don't even know, that is David Fielding. Yeah, that is David Fielding, I think. Yeah, it is him. But when they did his face like that, it looks weird. And also, what's even weirder, the effect when Zoltar and Alpha teleport the Rangers, that effect was, the effects here was so bad that, see, one of the reasons why that if they were to go with this version of the pilot with these bad special effects, this is why Power Rangers would have never been picked up by any network whatsoever. And there's something about Alpha's design, and I'll talk about a little bit in a few seconds, but I do want to point out how they did this differently, how Zordon and Alpha, I'm going to still stay with the Zordon name. Zoltar sounds kind of stupid to me, but it's the testing name. I liked it the way how, and also Zach, comparing himself to a Ninja Turtle. Yeah, no wonder that's such a coincidence, because in the Boom Studio comics later on, they mention, in the Boom Studio comics later on, like where we are now, they would, the Mighty Morphin team would team up with the Ninja Turtles in that 5-part crossover with TMNT and MMPR, and then also later on but beforehand, Power Rangers in space with the Next Mutation Ninja Turtles. But if you want to hear my commentary on that episode, check that out on my channel. The civilian outfits that Jason, Kimberly, Zach, and Billy wear, the clothing attire they wore in this pilot will be used on some early MMPR merchandise, especially Billy's hairdo from this. And briefly, as soon as they showed more of Rita attacking the city, you can briefly see some civilian stock footage from Bioman, because from what I remember and from what I heard on Ranger Wiki, and when I was doing a lot of research of how Haim Saban tried to bring Power Rangers to life and adapting Sentai into Power Rangers and meshing Japanese footage and American footage, the first Sentai that Saban wanted to adapt was going to be Bioman. And I don't know what was the extent of them. As soon as Zordon tells the Rangers about their dinosaur and their Ranger powers, did they got to generically morph into the stock puppet imagery of the zoo and the dinosaurs from Zoo Ranger's opening? When I look at that, that's pretty creepy. But like I was saying, because Bioman, now anyway, I'm off topic as soon as I saw more creepy stuff about it. But anyway, Bioman was going to be the first Sentai they were going to adapt in the Power Rangers, but that was like back in the 80s when Haim Saban, after being on a business trip, trying to find a way after he had saw something that had 5 people multicolored spandex with these powers and robots fighting rubber-suited monsters, and then he got the idea of figuring out what was that source show that had this, and thought this would make a cool show for kids one day. And that's how he got the idea of wanting to bring that show and make it into Power Rangers, and in this case Super Sentai. Now about Alpha's design, real quick. Alpha's design looks like something out of an 80s, an 80s sci-fi movie or something for a kid's show from the a sci-fi show from the 60s. People say he looks like Johnny Five, but I don't know who Johnny Five is though. And basically, half of the dialogue when the Rangers head out and when the other Rangers didn't think they believe in Zordon, they thought the whole them becoming Rangers was stupid. The whole idea, like they're going to believe in a floating head who gives them these powers and robots. But at least they pertained that element and several elements, and they also had to reshoot most of this. Yeah, I don't understand what Kimberly screaming. It was, I figured that's what they also did when they foreshadowed that with Kimberly screaming all the time in the first MMPR movie. Of course, they will reshoot the fight with the Rangers fighting the putties for the first time outside of the command center, where the mountains are, where the command center is. But the fight choreography is so sloppy. I'm like, oh my god, if this is how we ended up with the series back then, I'm like, oh my god, the series would have never got picked up, like I said. The fighting, the corny acting. Well, even though MMPR is known for its corny acting, but it works, and it still does. But in the pilot episode, I say the dialogue and the acting here is so super corny. It feels like this is the kind of, it's like they probably made Power Rangers in the late 80s, because the 80s is known for its corny acting, and then the Rangers have to yell help. Like, come on, they got their morphers that Zordon gave them. Their morph sequence is based off of that of the Zoo Rangers morphs, where they yell Dino Buckla in the original Zoo Ranger. But again, before we even got the finalized effect work that we get later on the actual series, this is what they had to work with back then. They didn't have the kind of special and visual effects stuff that we got in the actual episode. And then with that footage of the putty scratching its head, that would be used in the episode that episode when Kimberly was with her Uncle Steve, when they were reminiscing about being Power Rangers, after just 10 episodes into the series or so. They would reuse this footage again in the actual Day of the Dumpster pilot, when they would face the putties, and Goldar was going to be called Flydar. Was originally called Flydar in this pilot, but at least, and then also the guys show Goldar in the background, which this is another editing mistake, because again, we didn't have the kind of editing software we had back then yet, so there's that. King Spinks is featured here, but I don't know what's the extent of that. But I get that. They were trying to, Saban at the time when they did this pilot, they were trying to find a way where the show could work by mishmashing Japanese action footage from Sentai with American English-speaking actors dubbing over this footage, and then with a new soundtrack, new sound effects, voice acting and all, taking what was from the Japanese and try to make it sound more American. Because again, this was when they were trying to work their way into this. And also, you can hear Tui Trang's, Trini here, ready to rock line and then some of the lines they say in the actual episode, which I don't know what. Because this was already when, after they had already finished editing and, such with this test pilot, that Audrey Dubois was fired from playing Trini and such. And that's how we ended up with our beloved, but sadly, departed Tui Trang in the actual series. Now, the Megazord sequence sound, the Megazord sequence voice is still the same, but, and the dialogue here is even more cornier. Also, I forgot to mention back when we had Bulk earlier, we didn't, in the pilot, they didn't had Skull yet. Jason Narvey was not even cast when they had Paul Schreier in this pilot at the time. They had some guy that was a test character for Skull back then. I don't know what was the point of King Spinks, but no, they should have just used the very first fight footage of the Rangers facing Goldar from one of the Zoo Ranger episodes and call it a day there. And then with Rita yelling about I have a headache, which, again, this is one of the reasons why I never really was a fan of Rita. Yeah, and then that slow motion shot of the Megazord going, with the camera focusing on the Megazord and then ending it out on in a cheesy note. I say that the way how they did this pilot back then, I guess I'm happy we didn't get this version of Day of the Dumpster, frankly, thank God. Because Though they would perfect it later on in the actual Day of the Dumpster that kicks off the franchise, right? Because this was so bad, and I rewatched it before I did this commentary track for it, but it's so bad, like, the effects is bad, especially on Zordon as Zoltar, and then the transformation effects was bad. The acting was, oh god, horrendous. It felt like amateur, middle school writing or something. I don't know. It just makes, watching this pilot by its quality, it makes me think they did this pilot back in 1991 or something. Even though they were going to do Zoo, before but Zoo Ranger was in 91, 92. Common sense, they could have adapted, Jetman footage or something, or Bioman at the time. But of course, they had to work with the Zoo Ranger footage because dinosaurs were going to be all the rage by the time Jurassic Park came in. Also, Kimberly's line when she talks about how the helmet makes her hair messed up, that's changed. So yeah, I'm glad that we didn't get this version of Day of the Dumpster, because I'm glad, because otherwise, if they released Mighty Morphin Power Rangers like this back then, the show would have been a colossal disaster and no network would have never picked this up.